So as we're getting into the discussion of interpreting feedback, I should pop into some of the questions we're getting from the audience because I've got my own prepared questions about it, but actually some of them are already kind of going after some of the really sort of salient points here. Like for instance, Mozatrack92 wants to know, how can you tell the difference between feedback you're getting that is noise and feedback that is actually useful? Like once the survey comes back, and and you, for instance, you've asked a bunch of open-ended questions. How do you turn a lot of those answers from open-ended questions into usable data?
To be honest, a lot of that comes down to like me, right? If I get a survey back and I start seeing responses that feel like noise and that feel like they're not actionable feedback, then that immediately tells me, oh crap, I just asked the wrong questions. Now I'm just gonna need to like figure out how to make some lemonade out of this. Like honestly, like anytime we're getting answers to our questions in these surveys, like it's very rare to get things that are completely useless. And when they are, I think it's probably pretty obvious, because if you ever find yourself like writing your life story or complaining about things that are perhaps completely unrelated to the game, that's noise.
So actually, one thing that I'm curious about is like what is the volume typically of responses to our surveys, or like different kinds of surveys that we do? Like how much of this data are you trying to process and turn into something useful?
It can really vary. So on the high end of things, we ran a survey when Homecoming launched. That I think that was in the like version of the game that actually was showing up on everyone's Xboxes, PCs, even on their phones if they were playing on xCloud. Once they played for like 1 hour, I want to say. We got a lot of responses to that one. I think all told there was like 2,200 across all of the different platforms.
Wow.
On the smaller end of things, the PTR surveys are a little more manageable. The 2 times we ran experiments for the infestations, or the infestations experiments we ran, both of those we got around 50 responses.
Is 50 still representative enough that you consider that data to be useful?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely would like more, but I'll take 50. And there might be questions where I start to dive into the data and I'm like, oh, well, difficulty again is a good example. In a perfect world, it would be great to have 50 of every people playing on every difficulty setting. And then I could say, okay, people on Green Zone think this is too easy, just about right, too hard. And instead what I'm doing is I'm taking 50 people who played on 5 different difficulty settings and being like, okay, so 10 people who played on Lethal think this is blah, 7 people who played on Nightmare think this is blah. And it's like, we're kind of reading tea leaves here. So are there just trends across all of them that we can be talking about? Or are there like specific aspects of difficulty that we should be paying attention to instead?
Oh, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah. So hearing just the sheer volume of the feedback doesn't actually tell you everything you need to know, because you have to subdivide the audience to get some of your most useful feedback, and then it can get really, really small and unrepresentative.
Exactly. And that's why it's important to be getting like 50 people as a reasonable starting point, because some percentage of those 50 people like something, some percentage of those 50 people don't like something, and we want to make sure that we've got enough of the people who like something to understand why they like it, enough people who didn't like it to understand why they didn't like it, right? And then we can be like, okay, are these the same thing? Because sometimes it'll literally be like, I love this, I hate this, and it's like, okay, well, is there clearly more of one group than the other? Or designer, decide who you'd like to make happy here. Glad that's not my job.
Yeah. I was gonna say, in terms of the question about noise, that's what I think of a lot, is that there's a lot of contradictory feedback that comes up, where it's like one player's like, there's way too much of this one thing, and then another person's like, there is not enough of this, and then it's definitely the conflicting things. I think what we often tend to do is try to find when there's like a specific thing that a lot of people are saying, like, oh, multiple people are having problems with this certain thing, and it's coming up a lot. It's like, that's probably not noise then. That's something we should pay attention to. When like 30% of the people are mentioning this one very specific thing, then it's probably something we should, take note of.
Yeah. That actually leads me into a question asked by Lady X in the chat. She says, "Hi, Jonathan. How do you categorize comments? Do you just put them into negative and positive buckets, or would it be, how do you transform, particularly like free response questions into data as you're sort of determining what they say and finding that 30% that all said the same thing? How do you do that?"
Yeah, so when I'm looking at like real, like open-ended text comments, usually I'm looking at those because I'm looking for a why. So either I might have run a survey where I asked people to provide some ratings for things, and I can be like, okay, the ratings for this feature for, about this question, or this is good. The ratings about this tell me this is bad. Or sometimes I'm even just literally asking people like, yes or no, is this good? Is this bad? Usually in fancier sounding words than that.
Got to put that PhD to work.
Exactly. And so like when I'm doing my first pass through the data from a survey, I'll be like, okay, this is good, this is bad, this is good, this is bad. This part is fun, this part is not fun. Here's an area, one of the goals where we're just completely blowing it, and here's a goal where we're on target. And then the next step is to go through the comments and be like, okay, I know this part is fun. Why is this part fun? I know this part is not fun. Why is it not fun? And so that's what I'm trying to get out of those comments at that point in time, is that why. And so honestly, I'll like just put a giant row of comments into a spreadsheet, or a giant column rather, not a row. And when it's a really big survey, like homecoming, I'm sorry, folks, I didn't read 2,200 comments for every question from the homecoming survey. Depending on the question, we'll go like, how many of these is enough that we think it'll tell us what we need to know? That number is usually around like 50 to 100. And so I might pull like 50 to 100 just comments, like pull them out randomly, more or less, to make sure I'm getting a representative sample and not just getting them from like one specific chunk in the middle of my raw data. And I'll just start going through those and do a process called coding, where I just like read a comment, come up with a way to just TLDR it for myself, right? And it'll be like, what's not fun? Camera sucks, camera sucks, camera sucks. What's fun? Driving's great, driving's great, driving's great.
So,
right?
So as you like notice trends, like you notice like, oh, I know I've seen this comment twice. Then you'll go and be like, okay, then I'll start putting the same, like basically coding these the same way. And as you find more of that comment, you'll code it the same way until you have an aggregate of like, oh, 19 people said this. And then
exactly.
You can run with that and treat it like almost like the same data you get from a multiple choice question.
Exactly. And that's how I figure out how prevalent these themes are. And because then I can get to the end of the section that I'm coding and be like, okay, out of 50 people, 30 people like the driving. I can or 30 people thought the best part was specifically driving, holding the door open, running over zombies. I may not have asked a question asking if that was good or not, but I can now tell the team, like, one of the things they really like about your game is holding the door open and running over zombies.
Yeah, I was going to say, in terms of the question about, whether we categorize it in negative or positive, I would say in the reports, it does kind of come down to that. I know when we actually go over, this might be jumping the gun a little bit on top, but when we go over the report with the user research team, like they do have it kind of broken down into like highlights and kind of lowlights, and like here's the the things that people really liked about this feature, and then here are the problems that came up. So it does kind of boil down to that essentially in the end, because especially for us, we definitely the problems are what we want to address, and so like the highlights are great. It's good to know that we're doing the job, but we're not going to change things because of those. Typically, we're not like. We're like, okay, we can leave that be, and it's the lowlights, the problems that we really want to address.
Yeah, and that's exactly why we try and break it down like that in our reports, because it can help a team understand like what they're scoping when they're planning out what to do, right? If I were to just take a finding that's for a new expansion, be like, okay, here's everything people thought about infestations, right? And I just put that all in one section, then it can become really hard for a team to be like, wait, is this part good or bad? I can't quite tell. And so we just put a report where it's like, here, first half, good, highlights, this part's working, this part's landing, this part's landing. and then break out. Here's the other section. Bad. Here are the lowlights. This isn't working. This isn't working. This isn't working. And that helps put a team in a position to be like, okay, this is a bunch of stuff we can ignore now. If we have to pay attention to, it's because when we're fixing this stuff, make sure it doesn't ruin this stuff all over again.
Yeah, totally. Because that can completely happen. Because we've got all of these interconnected systems in this game, it's really easy for changes to have unanticipated consequences. And that's part of what we're trying to find when we go to the PTR, ask people how the game is doing. Part of what we're trying to find is the unintended consequences that the players are going to notice after weeks of play that we were not going to be able to just guess in advance.
Sometimes they're even intended. Like that happens time to time where like the team will be talking about changing something and changing a feature, and then I'll think of them like, well, actually players talk about this specific aspect as a positive a lot, so we can't actually do anything to take, like, we got to be careful about that because players have specifically said that they like something, and so the different the team isn't privy to all the feedback, so there'll be certain things that the players talk about liking that a lot of the team isn't aware that players really like. So it's something that definitely I think that falls on me a lot, is to make sure we're like, okay, but the players have talked about this being a positive a lot, so we can't screw with that too much. We got to be careful about messing with that. So it does, a lot of times it is kind of intentional. It's just that we don't realize how much the players like it a lot.
So we're running a little bit on time, but I kind of wanted to make sure that we got into, once we've actually got the feedback and we've sort of, got a sense of, what the feedback is saying to us. How do we put that into action? Like Eric, like what is the process of, a survey has just come in, Jonathan's produced a report for it. How do you turn that into a plan of action for the team?
So it comes in a few phases. So the first thing is just kind of going over the report with Jonathan and the user research team. And so we kind of get the feature team together in a meeting, and he kind of runs us through the report and kind of breaks it down. And we get to ask any clarifying questions to make sure we actually kind of understand the problems that came up, and kind of maybe pitch some ideas of like what we think was happening. Because a lot of times, you have to interpret going from the feedback, to try to understand what the actual underlying problems are. Because sometimes you'll be looking at symptoms and you have to take a step back and kind of theorize what the actual problems were that were causing that symptoms. So we'll kind of do a meeting to kind of go over that stuff, so we kind of have a good idea of what the problems were that came up. And then we'll basically kind of then I mean, this is something that's kind of always in iteration. We're always working on how this process works. But offline, we'll kind of break those like individual problems up into kind of their own specific topics. And we'll talk about those kind of offline asynchronously. And then we'll eventually get together to have meetings to talk about any given topic. And then say, okay, now this problem, we've talked about it kind of offline asynchronously. Let's kind of go over the different the solutions that were proposed offline, and kind of try to figure out which ones we think are doable, which ones we think would solve it the best. And then it's just tasking it out essentially, and says, okay, so we think we got a good solution for this one. Let's make the tasks for it and get that done. I mean, and that's basically how it goes. It's just trying to get the team involved in helping to kind of brainstorm solutions to the problems. But it's always something we're kind of constantly working on and trying to improve the process there. And a big part of that is also then making sure we actually close the loop, I think.
Oh yeah.
Afterwards, like after. Oh yeah. I mean,
sorry.
again,
I was
this may be jumping the
excited
gun,
you were going to talk about this, so go for it.
Yeah, because then we'll address it. And a lot of times then after the part of the process is we'll brainstorm solutions, we'll discuss what we think the best solution is, we'll actually task it out, we'll implement it, and then we'll do internal play tests kind of then to try to get a little more, be like, okay, did that feel like it worked? Depending on how much time we have. Like a lot of times, after you've done a round of like PTR feedback and then you've done all the work to kind of address the problems, there's not a time to do another PTR push necessarily. And so then we'll resort to internal playtest to kind of see if that felt like it really solved the problem. And then after that, it's, closing the loop is a big part of that, is actually making sure we tell the audience, here are the problems we were looking at addressing, and here's how we address them. So they understand what the changes are and why they were made. And that goes for the internal playtest too. That's such an important thing to do, and it's really easy to forget to do that. I think teams have done that. It's very, very, very common, and every studio I've been at has been really bad about closing the loop. But it's such an important part of the process, and it makes the people who are participating in the playtests really feel like their voice is being heard, because it is. But they have to know that it is being heard. So they, reiterating, like for us when we do internal playtest, after we kind of like figure out what we're going to do, we in our playtest channel we'll be like, okay, here are the things that came up and here's what we're going to do to address them. And then for like a live release, we will, it goes into the patch notes. We're like, okay, so we've made these round of changes. These are the problems that came up from the PTR, and then this is how we address them to make sure that the players know how we're addressing things.
Yeah, I think one of the one common experience I have with like interacting with players like on social media and stuff like that is they'll say, "When are you going to fix this bug?" And I'll be like, "Oh, I don't know." And I'll go and I'll make it, go to our Slack channel where we make live reports, and I'll be like, "Hey, a player just asked me when are we going to fix this bug?" And someone will be like, "We did fix it like 3 updates ago." But the player, their experience with the bug happened months ago. And as far as they know, it never got fixed. And so they haven't had that experience again, but they've been playing, like anticipating that they might at any time because they thought it wasn't fixed. And so getting back to them and letting them know what we actually fixed is a really important part of the process.
Yeah.